In the first week of September 1980, a federal bankruptcy court in Cleveland, Ohio, received a Chapter 11 filing from the White Motor Corporation. The paperwork represented a standard corporate restructuring of a massive industrial conglomerate, but the physical shockwave hit the American Midwest within hours. Across Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas, independent farm equipment dealers walked out to their lots, stared at rows of silver tractors bearing the White Field Boss name, and realized the parent company that built them had just run out of money. They did not know if the assembly lines in Charles City would open on Monday. They did not know if the replacement hydraulic pumps they ordered for the fall harvest would ever arrive. For an American farmer standing in a dealership in 1980, a heavy row crop tractor without a guaranteed parts supply was not a working machine. It was a $40,000 paperweight. The paradox was written directly into the metal of those stranded machines. Just a decade earlier, those exact same dealership lots had been the absolute centers of local agricultural power. They had not been selling silver corporate tractors. They had been selling green Olivers and yellow Minneapolis Molines, two of the most deeply trusted, historically proven names in American farming. They were machines bought by grandfathers, trusted by fathers, and expected to be passed down to sons. But the real story of white farm equipment in America is not merely the financial collapse of a heavy manufacturing conglomerate under the weight of a debt crisis. It is the story of a corporate spreadsheet colliding with the dirt. It is the story of what happens when executives decide that generations of rural loyalty can be bought, merged, stripped of their heritage, and painted silver. Every week, we document the empires of iron that built the American farm and the economic forces that tore them apart. We tell the stories of the machines that worked the soil and the people left behind when the factories went dark. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not in an Iowa field, but in an Ohio boardroom in 1960. The origin of this specific agricultural empire did not begin with a mechanic experimenting in a Midwestern barn, nor did it start with a blacksmith forging a better plow. It began in a corporate boardroom in Cleveland, Ohio, at the end of the 1950s. At that time, the White Motor Corporation was a titan of the American highway. They built heavy-duty commercial trucks. They understood diesel engines, fleet contracts, and highway logistics. But the executives in Cleveland were looking for diversification. They looked at the post-war American agricultural boom, a period when family farms were rapidly mechanizing, expanding their acreage, and requiring massive infusions of horsepower, and they saw an entirely new sector ready to be organized. But the American farm equipment market in 1960 was not a blank spreadsheet. It was a deeply entrenched tribal ecosystem. Before White Motor Corporation entered the field, an American farmer did not merely purchase a machine based on horsepower or fuel economy. They bought a color. They bought a legacy. A farmer in Illinois drove a red International Harvester because his father had driven one. A farmer in Iowa bought a green John Deere because the local dealer was a trusted neighbor who would leave a warm bed at midnight to deliver a hydraulic hose during the harvest season. The dealer network, the local system of sales, parts availability, trained mechanics, and warranty support that kept tractors working was the absolute lifeblood of agricultural commerce. You could not simply design a new tractor in a vacuum, paint it a new color, and expect American farmers to abandon their generational loyalties. The barrier to entry was practically insurmountable. So, the executives in Cleveland decided they would not build an agricultural heritage from scratch. They would buy it. In November 1960, the White Motor Corporation executed its first major strike into the American dirt. They purchased the farm equipment division of the Oliver Corporation. Records from the period indicate the acquisition cost roughly $34 million, equivalent to over $300 million today. With that single transaction, White instantly acquired a legacy that dated back to the mid-19th century. They gained control of the sprawling Oliver tractor plant in Charles City, Iowa, the very city where the word tractor had been coined decades earlier. More importantly, White inherited Oliver's fiercely loyal American distribution channel. Suddenly, a truck company in Ohio was the parent organization to roughly 2,000 independent farm equipment dealers across the United States. But Cleveland was not finished. The corporate appetite required more market share to justify the agricultural division. In 1962, White reached across the border to acquire Cockshut Farm Equipment, a Canadian manufacturer with a strong footprint in the northern United States and the wheat belts. Cockshut brought reliable combine harvesters and a dedicated northern dealer network into the corporate fold. Then, in 1963, White made its most aggressive move yet. They purchased Minneapolis Moline, a beloved American manufacturer headquartered in Hopkins, Minnesota. Minneapolis Moline was famous for building heavy, durable machines, painted in a distinctive prairie gold. They were legendary in the wheat fields of Kansas and the Dakotas, known for high-torque engines that could pull heavy implements through difficult soil all day without overheating. In the space of just 3 years, the White Motor Corporation had assembled a mechanical empire. By the end of 1963, trade publications like Implement and Tractor Magazine recognized White as the 6th largest farm equipment manufacturer in the United States. They had effectively bought their way to the top tier of American agriculture. In those early years, the strategy was surprisingly respectful of the dirt. White operated Oliver, Cockshut, and Minneapolis Moline as wholly owned, separate subsidiaries. They understood initially that the colors mattered. For the American farmer, nothing appeared to change. If you walked into an Oliver dealership in Indiana in 1964, you were still greeted by the same local owner. You still bought an Oliver 1850 row crop tractor, a machine designed with adjustable wheel spacing to cultivate between planted rows without crushing the harvest. It was still painted meadow green. It still wore the classic Oliver shield on the grill. If you farmed in Nebraska, you could still go to your local Minneapolis Moline dealer and buy a Prairie Gold G1000, trusting the familiar mechanics in the back shop to keep it running. The name White was nowhere on the sheet metal. The corporate umbrella was invisible. The tractors worked. The dealers prospered. The farmers remained loyal. By 1969, White Farm Equipment was officially organized as a formal subsidiary to manage this sprawling, three-headed agricultural giant. They had the engineering talent of 3 distinct companies. They had the manufacturing capacity of massive plants in Iowa, Minnesota, and Indiana. They had an installed base of tens of thousands of working machines across the North American continent. But in the corporate headquarters in Cleveland, the spreadsheet was beginning to clash with the reality of the dealership lot. Executives looked at the ledger and saw profound inefficiencies. They saw 3 separate engineering departments designing different solutions for the same problems. They saw 3 distinct parts supply chains duplicating effort. Most dangerously, they saw territories where an Oliver dealer, a Cockshut dealer, and a Minneapolis Moline dealer were all competing against each other for the exact same farmer's dollar, all while funneling profits back to the exact same parent company. Corporate logic dictates that redundancy must be eliminated to maximize profit. A truck manufacturer understands standardization, they understand economies of scale, they understand that building one uniform product is cheaper than building 3 regional favorites. The executives in Ohio decided it was time to stop operating 3 different heritage brands. It was time to consolidate the engineering. It was time to merge the dealer networks. It was time to create a single, unified line of tractors that would challenge John Deere and International Harvester head-on. They were about to introduce the American farmer to the silver paint. The transition from a collection of beloved heritage brands into a single unified industrial force required a physical catalyst. The sprawling Oliver plant in Charles City, Iowa, stood like a dark, towering mansion of Midwestern industry, a multi-story brick fortress where raw iron entered and finished horsepower rolled out. For decades, it had been a cathedral of noise, manufacturing the green tractors that built the local economy. But in the early 1970s, the executives in Cleveland ordered the Charles City plant to stop building the past and start building the corporate future. To ensure the financial survival of these historic factories, the parent company decided they had to completely erase their historic identities. The green paint was drained. The prairie gold was abandoned. The corporate ambitions of the White Motor Corporation were about to be hammered into a stark, physical reality. The breakthrough arrived in the form of the White Field Boss series. When the new tractors rolled out of the Charles City plant, they looked like machines built for an entirely different century. They were painted a striking industrial silver, accented by sharp charcoal and black stripes. For an American farmer accustomed to the warm, familiar colors of the local dealership, the visual shock was profound. But beneath the futuristic silver sheet metal, White Farm Equipment had engineered an incredibly potent hybrid. They had taken the legendary, indestructible rear-end castings of the Oliver tractor line and bolted them to modern, high-horsepower engines. The crown jewel of this new corporate fleet was the White 4150 Field Boss. To understand what made this machine matter, you have to look at how it physically interacted with the dirt. The 4150 was an articulated four-wheel drive tractor, a massive machine with a pivot joint in the middle of its chassis, allowing it to steer by bending its entire body rather than turning its front wheels. This design spread the vehicle's massive weight evenly across four identical towering tires, minimizing soil compaction while maximizing traction. It was powered by a Caterpillar 3208 V8 diesel engine, a proven off-the-shelf commercial block that delivered immense torque and could be serviced by thousands of existing heavy-duty truck mechanics across the country. Behind that roaring V8 sat the over/under hydral shift transmission, a specialized hydraulic gearbox that allowed the operator to shift between three distinct speed ranges on the go without ever touching the clutch. If a farmer pulling a heavy chisel plow suddenly hit a dense patch of wet clay, they did not have to stop and lose their momentum. They simply pulled a lever, dropped a gear, multiplied their torque, and pulled straight through. In 1974, a new White 4150 retailed for roughly $25,000, equivalent to about $158,000 today. At that moment, a comparably powered articulated machine from Steiger, or a top-tier row crop tractor, a machine specifically designed with adjustable wheel spacing to cultivate between planted rows, from John Deere could easily cost thousands more. For a Midwestern family farm looking to drastically expand its acreage to keep up with the booming commodity prices of the 1970s, that price point was a revelation. It offered the raw drawbar pull, the sheer pulling force a tractor can deliver to an implement through the steel hitch of a premium heavy tillage machine at a price that did not require betting the entire family farm. The American distribution breakthrough did not happen in a boardroom. It happened in the dirt. At the 1974 Farm Progress Show in Illinois, tens of thousands of farmers gathered to watch the silver machines work. There was a dry, undeniable irony in the air. The farmers were skeptical of the corporate silver paint, mourning the loss of the Oliver and Minneapolis Moline names. But when the plows were dropped into the soil, the nostalgia evaporated. The 4150 gripped the earth. The Caterpillar engine roared. The articulated frame bent through the mud. The validation was swift and institutional. The Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the ultimate independent testing authority that turned manufacturer horsepower claims into published, undeniable numbers on a dynamometer, put the new White tractors through their grueling evaluations. The official reports confirmed what the farmers had seen in the field. the silver machines delivered the exact horsepower and fuel economy they promised. Suddenly, the sheer scale of White's consolidated dealer network became an overwhelming advantage. A farmer in the heavy wet clay of the Red River Valley in North Dakota could buy a massive 150 for spring tillage. A mid-sized operator in the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, could buy a smaller, white 105 for daily utility chores. Large-scale wheat growers in Sedgwick County, Kansas, adopted the silver machines to pull massive grain drills. Regional distributors across the Texas Panhandle began pushing the Field Boss line to cotton farmers who needed reliable, heavy-duty horsepower. The American moat for White farm equipment was not just cheap power. It was the fusion of brilliant Midwestern farm engineering with the brutal efficiency of a highway truck corporation. The executives had successfully integrated the legacy of three dead companies into one living, breathing mechanical force. The name on the sheet metal was no longer a generational heritage. It was a corporate specification. By 1976, White farm equipment was no longer an experiment in corporate consolidation. It was an industrial titan standing at the absolute peak of the American agricultural boom. The parent company in Cleveland had gambled that farmers would trade generational color loyalty for raw, cost-effective horsepower, and for a brief, spectacular window in the mid-1970s. That gamble paid off entirely. In 1976, White reported agricultural equipment sales exceeding $350 million, roughly $1.9 billion today. In an industry historically dominated by the green machinery of John Deere and the red steel of International Harvester, capturing that volume of capital meant White had successfully carved out a massive, fiercely defended territory in the American dirt. They built the tractors, they expanded the implements, they blanketed the Midwest. The Silver Field Boss tractors were no longer a novelty on the American landscape. They were the mechanical backbone of thousands of farming operations. In the deep black soil of Story County, Iowa, White 2-155 row crop tractors pulled heavy planters through the crucial spring windows. In the sprawling wheat belts of Thomas County, Kansas, the massive articulated 4-150s dragged broad-acre air seeders, machines designed to blow seed and fertilizer into the soil across 40-foot widths from dawn until midnight. Dairy operations in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, relied on the smaller White 270 utility tractors for daily chore work. Cotton growers in Lubbock, Texas, used high-clearance White machines to spray defoliant. Potato farmers in Bingham County, Idaho, and custom harvesters in the Red River Valley of North Dakota all depended on the Silver Fleet. The manufacturing heart of this empire, the Charles City, Iowa plant, was operating at a fever pitch. At its peak, the facility employed roughly 3,000 American workers. For a rural Midwestern town with a population of less than 10,000, the factory was not just an employer, it was the entire economic engine of the county. The brick walls vibrated with the continuous roar of dynamometers, heavy diagnostic machines used to test the raw horsepower and torque of fresh diesel engines before they were installed. Train cars loaded with raw casting iron rolled in, and flatbeds chained down with silver horsepower rolled out. Every shift, every day, every season. To step onto an authorized White dealership lot in Illinois or Indiana in the late 1970s was to witness the peak of corporate farm engineering. The network had stabilized to roughly 1,400 dedicated dealers across North America. These were not corporate-owned stores. They were independent, multi-generational family businesses that had survived the traumatic loss of the Oliver and Minneapolis Moline brands by throwing their full weight behind the silver paint. A dealer in Ohio or Nebraska did not just sell a tractor, they maintained a multi-million-dollar parts inventory. They dispatched service trucks into muddy fields at 2 in the morning to replace a blown hydraulic pump, a mechanical device that pressurizes fluid to lift heavy implements, because a stalled tractor during the autumn harvest could cost a farmer their entire annual profit. The American cultural moment that fueled this explosion was dictated directly by Washington. In the early 1970s, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz famously instructed American farmers to plant fence row to fence row. The Soviet Union was buying millions of tons of American grain. Commodity prices skyrocketed. Farm credit was loose, interest rates were manageable, and the mandate from the government was clear: expand your acreage or be swallowed by a neighbor who did. To farm more acres, a family did not need more farmhands. They needed more horsepower. They needed machines that could pull wider implements through tougher soil at faster speeds. On a fading October afternoon in the Dakotas, when an early frost threatened to destroy thousands of acres of unharvested wheat, the sheer torque of a white field boss pulling a massive chisel plow could mean the difference between securing a family's financial future and surrendering the deed to the bank. White Farm Equipment rose to meet that exact desperate demand. The company offered a complete wall-to-wall agricultural system. They sold the White 9700 Axial Combine, a massive harvesting machine that used a single, spinning longitudinal rotor to separate grain from the stalk, a revolutionary design that reduced grain damage and increased harvesting speed. They sold plows. They sold planters. A farmer could theoretically prepare the soil, plant the seed, cultivate the rows, and harvest 10,000 acres without ever turning the key on a piece of equipment that did not bear the White corporate logo. The sheer scale of White's product ecosystem allowed them to penetrate agricultural markets that had traditionally been locked down by older, domestic brands. In the heavy, humid air of the Mississippi Delta, cotton farmers utilized the specialized White 2135, relying on its closed-center hydraulic system, a pressurized fluid circuit that only pumped oil when a steering or lifting demand was made, saving engine horsepower and reducing dangerous heat buildup during grueling summer work. In the vast, irrigated expanses of California's Central Valley, growers trusted the narrow-track versions of the Silver tractors to pull specialized implements through tightly packed orchards. The Silver machines were no longer viewed as a corporate compromise. They were recognized as premium, heavy-duty agricultural tools. By 1979, the American dealer network was operating at maximum velocity. At large regional distributors in the Texas Panhandle, or at premier, multi-generational dealerships across rural Wisconsin and Ohio, the showroom floors were testaments to industrial confidence. A farmer walking through the glass doors of a White dealership did not see the ghost of Oliver or the fading shadow of Minneapolis Moline. They saw a wall of specialized parts bins, racks of heavy-duty belts, and a service bay capable of splitting a massive articulated tractor in half for transmission repairs. They saw mechanics whose coveralls bore the White logo, men who had been flown to the Charles City Engineering Center for specialized training on Caterpillar diesel blocks and hydraul shift gearboxes. That infrastructure was not merely corporate branding. For an operation managing 3,000 acres of soybeans, a trained mechanic with a fully stocked parts shelf was the only barrier between a successful autumn harvest and a catastrophic financial default. The ultimate validation of this era occurred on the demonstration fields of the 1979 Farm Progress Show. White Farm Equipment arrived not as an underdog, but as an undeniable heavyweight. They showcased the massive White 4210, a towering articulated beast that delivered over 200 horsepower to the drawbar. When the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory evaluated the 4210, the official documentation proved that the Silver machines could compete blow for blow with the largest models from Steiger and Versatile. The test recorded massive pulling force, Hemiver Isto Robi Storiro Wolfer, confirming that White's engineering department had successfully merged brute power with mechanical reliability. Simultaneously, they aggressively demonstrated the 9700 Axial Combine, proving to traditional skeptics that a single rotor harvesting design could rapidly outperform conventional multi-cylinder machines in dense crops. The crowds of farmers who gathered around the silver equipment were not mourning the past. They were actively pulling out their checkbooks, leveraging loose credit from local banks, and financing the future. At this zenith, the agricultural division of the White Motor Corporation was generating roughly $400 million in annual sales. It was a staggering sum, equivalent to more than $1.5 billion today. The farm equipment branch had become so profitable, so fiercely efficient, that it was actually subsidizing the parent company in Cleveland. While White Motor Corporation's core heavy truck business was beginning to bleed cash due to shifting highway regulations, changing freight contracts, and rising labor costs, the tractors built in Iowa and Minnesota were keeping the entire conglomerate afloat. The Charles City plant was running multiple production shifts. The parts depots in Illinois and Kansas were moving thousands of tons of replacement steel every month. The independent dealers across the American grain belt were signing long-term franchise agreements. They poured new concrete. They erected massive illuminated white signs. They hired more technicians to keep the silver fleet moving. To the men driving the tractors and the families selling them, the transition was complete. The trauma of the corporate buyout had faded. The silver paint had earned its place in the dirt. The engines were loud, the dealership network was aggressively expanding, and the commodity prices flowing from the grain elevators seemed permanent. The executives in Ohio had successfully engineered a General Motors of American agriculture. They had captured the loyalty of the American farmer. They had built an empire of iron that looked utterly invincible, standing tall against the wind on the Great Plains. They did not realize the wind was about to become a hurricane. In the autumn of 1979, the fundamental mathematics of American agriculture changed almost overnight. The Federal Reserve, battling historic national inflation, dramatically spiked interest rates. The era of loose, accessible farm credit, the financial engine that had allowed thousands of operators to rapidly expand their acreage and purchase massive silver tractors, froze completely. A farmer who had planned to finance a $60,000 articulated tractor suddenly faced borrowing costs approaching 20%. Across the Midwest, the checkbook snapped shut. This macroeconomic shock exposed the fatal structural weakness of white farm equipment. They had built an extraordinary product line, but they were inextricably chained to the White Motor Corporation. The parent company in Cleveland was bleeding. The heavy commercial truck market was deregulating, competition was intensifying, and labor costs at Ohio manufacturing facilities were climbing. To keep the failing truck division afloat throughout the late 1970s, corporate executives had systematically siphoned capital away from the highly profitable farm equipment branch. When the agricultural credit crisis hit, White Motor did not have the cash reserves to weather a severe, sustained drop in tractor sales. On September 4, 1980, the White Motor Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At the time, it was one of the largest corporate failures in American industrial history. For the executives in Ohio, the bankruptcy was a structured, necessary financial maneuver to protect assets from creditors. For the 1,400 independent farm equipment dealers spread across the United States, it was an immediate, terrifying crisis. When a heavy machinery manufacturer enters bankruptcy, the entire ecosystem of agricultural trust collapses. A farmer in Kansas staring at a silver field boss, 4150 on a dealership lot, did not care about a corporate restructuring plan in Cleveland. They cared about the hydraulic pump. If a tractor sheared a transmission shaft in the middle of a grueling wheat harvest, the local dealer needed an ironclad guarantee that the replacement part would arrive from the central depot in Illinois within 48 hours. The bankruptcy filing shattered that guarantee. Without reliable parts support, the silver machines instantly transitioned from premium agricultural assets to severe financial liabilities. Furthermore, the financial mechanism that kept dealerships alive collapsed. Floor planning, the specialized short-term inventory financing that allows a dealer to physically stock heavy machinery on their lot before a farmer actually purchases it, evaporated. Regional banks looked at the corporate chaos surrounding White Motor and refused to finance the silver tractors. Dealership lots filled up with unsold, immovable inventory. In 1981, desperate to liquidate assets and satisfy the bankruptcy courts, White Motor Corporation sold the White Farm Equipment Division to TIC Investment Corporation, a holding company based in Texas. For a brief, hopeful moment, the American dealer network exhaled. TIC promised to inject fresh capital. They promised to keep the massive Charles City assembly lines moving. They promised to honor all existing warranties. They even pushed forward with the introduction of the new Series 3 tractors, featuring updated cabs and improved closed-center hydraulics, hoping to signal resilience to a panicked market. But TIC had purchased a heavy agricultural manufacturer at the exact moment the broader American farm economy was entering a catastrophic depression. The 1980s farm crisis devastated rural America. Land values plummeted. Commodity prices crashed. A federal embargo on grain shipments to the Soviet Union left millions of bushels of American corn and wheat rotting in silos. Across Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska, farmers were not buying new high-horsepower tractors. They were declaring bankruptcy. They were liquidating their grandfathers' homesteads at county auctions. Under the crushing weight of this environment, TIC Investment Corporation struggled to capitalize the farm division. They lacked the deep financial reserves of competitors like John Deere or International Harvester, legacy companies that were also hemorrhaging millions of dollars, but had the sheer structural mass to survive the decade. White Farm Equipment began to starve. Production schedules at the Charles City plant were drastically slashed. Thousands of American factory workers were laid off. Engineering budgets for future tractor platforms were frozen. The pipeline of mechanical innovation simply stopped. As the financial instability deepened, the lifeblood of the empire began to bleed out. The independent American dealers, the men who had survived the death of Oliver and Minneapolis Moline, who had convinced their neighbors to trust the silver paint, began to jump ship. A dealer in Wisconsin, whose family had sold machinery to the same dairy farmers for 50 years, could not survive on loyalty to a failing corporate holding company. They began taking down the illuminated white signage. They signed contracts with Case or Ford. Every time a local dealership dropped the white franchise, they're all deltreasing some crunchen. The brand lost its physical anchor in that county. The parts shelves were cleared. The trained mechanics were reassigned. The physical footprint of the company began to rapidly recede from the American landscape. The competitive displacement of the silver tractors was methodical and absolute. As independent white dealers in places like Black Hawk County, Iowa, and Fresno County, California, realized that TIC Investment Corporation could no longer finance their inventory, they were forced into a desperate mode of operational survival. The massive American agricultural conglomerates recognized this vulnerability and moved in immediately. Representatives from John Deere and the newly merged Case 1H, a corporate behemoth formed in 1985, when Tenneco purchased the failing agricultural assets of International Harvester, walked into struggling white dealerships with highly lucrative transition contracts. They offered the one thing white could no longer provide: absolute financial stability. If a local dealer agreed to paint their building green or red, the new parent company would guarantee their floor planning, restock their parts shelves immediately, and honor the trade-in values of older equipment. For the American farmer, the decision to abandon white farm equipment was rarely born of malice. It was pure, cold economics. a wheat farmer in North Dakota who had purchased a massive white 4210 articulated tractor in 1979, now possessed a machine that was depreciating rapidly on the secondary market. If a critical transmission component failed, the local dealer might not exist anymore to order a replacement. If the dealer did exist, the required part might be back-ordered for months because the central corporate supply chain was tangled in ongoing bankruptcy litigation. Facing a tight, unforgiving harvest window, that farmer had no choice but to trade the silver machine in for a John Deere 8650. The used market, the crucial secondary economy where farmers buy older machines, rely on known parts, and expect predictable reliability, became fundamentally toxic for the White brand. The resale value of the silver tractors collapsed completely. The compounding financial strain eventually broke TIC Investment Corporation. In 1985, exactly 5 years after the initial, catastrophic collapse of the White Motor Corporation, White Farm Equipment was forced back into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a humiliating, devastating cycle for the surviving dealerships. The corporate umbrella had failed them twice in half a decade. The remnants of the corporate empire were subsequently purchased by Allied Products Corporation, a manufacturing conglomerate that also owned the New Idea agricultural implement brand. Allied executives attempted a desperate resuscitation. They merged the operations into a new entity named White New Idea. Recognizing that the heavy articulated tractor market was now utterly saturated by Steiger, Versatile, and John Deere, they permanently ceased production of the massive four-wheel drive units. Instead, they focused entirely on mid-range and heavy row crop tractors. They introduced the White Workhorse series, painting the new tractors in a revised silver and red color scheme, desperately trying to signal a fresh, reliable start to a deeply cynical market. But technological disruption was rapidly outpacing White's frozen, battered engineering budget. Throughout the 1980s, while White engineers fought simply to keep the factory doors open, their competitors were fundamentally altering tractor design. John Deere and Case Wine H were introducing advanced electronic monitoring, refined power shift transmissions, complex gearboxes that used microprocessors to execute smooth, clutchless gear changes under extreme draft loads, and radically redesigned ergonomic operator cabs. White's Workhorse series, though mechanically sound and built upon the legendary, indestructible rear-end castings developed by Oliver 20 years earlier, was essentially aging 1970s. Technology repackaged for the late 1980s. Furthermore, the scale of American agriculture had changed permanently. The loose credit and boom times of the 1970s, where farmers expanded from fence row to fence row, were dead. The late 1980s market demanded extreme operational efficiency, massive corporate dealer support, and high, predictable resale value. White New Idea could offer none of those guarantees to the American farmer. The final, fatal blow to the historical legacy of the brand occurred at the exact physical location where the American tractor industry had arguably been born. The sprawling, multi-story brick manufacturing plant in Charles City, Iowa, the legendary facility that had pumped out green Oliver machines for decades and silver Field Boss tractors during the peak of the White Empire, was deemed entirely inefficient by the accountants at Allied Products. The factory was too large, too old, and simply too expensive to heat and maintain for the low volume of tractors currently being ordered. In 1988, Allied executives made the quiet, brutal decision to abandon Charles City entirely. They announced that all remaining tractor production would be relocated to a smaller, more modern facility in Coldwater, Ohio. For the American workers in Iowa, the decision was the final, bitter end to nearly a century of industrial pride. The Midwestern town that had practically invented the word tractor was stripped of its manufacturing heart. The heavy casting molds were moved or sold for scrap. The dynamometers were disconnected and hauled away. The vast assembly floors, which had once employed thousands of local residents and shipped heavy horsepower to every corner of the North American continent, were systematically emptied. Allied products could not survive. The farm economy remained too weak. The sales volume never recovered. The parent company sold the assets. The independent dealers finally gave up. The Ohio assembly lines stopped moving. The final silver tractors were shipped. The engineering departments were dissolved. The massive factory doors were locked. The parts warehouses went dark. The corporate spreadsheets failed. The silver paint faded. The empire of iron was dead. The physical death of the Charles City plant was not the immediate end of the White Tractor name. In 1991, the remnants of the White Tractor division were acquired by the Alice Gleaner Corporation, a rapidly expanding American agricultural conglomerate known today as AGCO. A GCO was essentially an organization built from the orphans of the 1980s farm crisis. They understood that the White name, despite its turbulent corporate history, still held a stubborn, residual equity among certain American farmers. For the next decade, AGCO continued to build and sell tractors bearing the White name, maintaining the signature silver paint and outfitting them with reliable Cummins diesel engines. But the American agricultural landscape had fundamentally consolidated. By 2001, AGCO executives recognized that supporting multiple overlapping heritage brands was exactly the kind of corporate inefficiency that had destroyed the original White Motor Corporation. They officially retired the White Tractor brand, painting their new models in AGCO orange, and eventually folding the lineage into the Massey Ferguson and Challenger lines. After 40 years of corporate mergers, buyouts, bankruptcies, and restructuring, the silver paint was finally permanently erased from the American farm equipment catalog. The silence from the factories, however, did not silence the machines. Today, across the American Midwest, an incredibly dedicated preservation and enthusiast community maintains the physical legacy of the White farm equipment empire. At county fairs in Illinois and antique tractor pulls in Ohio, you will find meticulous, running examples of the White 4150 and the 2105. But the preservation of White is profoundly complicated by the preservation of what White destroyed. Among the Hartpar Oliver Collectors Association and the Minneapolis Moline enthusiast groups, the silver tractors are often viewed as the machines that killed their beloved heritage brands. It is not uncommon to find a restoration shop in rural Indiana where a mechanic has taken a late-model White tractor, stripped away the silver paint and the charcoal stripes, and repainted it in Oliver Meadow Green, a physical, defiant reversal of the 1970s corporate boardroom decisions. Yet for many working family farms, the original silver machines still matter for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with nostalgia. On a mid-sized cattle operation in eastern Nebraska, a well-maintained White 2135 is not a museum piece. It is a daily utility vehicle. It runs the PTO, the rotating power takeoff shaft that transfers engine power to implements, on a feed grinder. It pulls a heavy grain cart during the autumn harvest. It matters because a mechanical tractor from the late 1970s, powered by a standard Caterpillar or Cummins diesel block, can be repaired by a local mechanic with standard hand tools. It does not require proprietary diagnostic software to clear an emissions code before the transmission will engage. It offers brute, uncompromised pulling force without the burden of a six-figure loan. The physical site where that force was forged is now largely a ghost. If you drive into Charles City, Iowa today, you will not find the towering, multi-story brick fortress that once housed the Oliver and White assembly lines. After Allied Products abandoned the facility in the late 1980s, the sprawling industrial complex sat empty, a decaying monument to Midwestern manufacturing. In 1993, a massive, spectacular fire consumed a massive portion of the original tractor works. Today, much of the site has been cleared. Where thousands of American workers once bolted heavy cast-iron transmission housings to roaring V8 engines, there are now empty concrete slabs, overgrown chain-link fences, and light commercial buildings. The roar of the dynamometers is entirely gone. There is, however, a surprise footnote to the corporate failure. While the white tractors were eventually erased, the company's implement division produced a piece of technology that outlived the empire. The white planter line, utilizing a highly advanced positive air seed metering system, a pneumatic mechanism that pinned individual seeds to a rotating disc for incredibly precise planting depth and spacing, was so superior to its competitors that AGCO kept it alive for decades. Long after the silver tractors vanished, American farmers were still buying white-branded planters to trail behind their green or red machines. The intellectual property developed under the failing corporate umbrella quietly became a cornerstone of modern American precision agriculture. The American story of white farm equipment is a stark philosophical lesson in the limits of corporate engineering. The executives at the White Motor Corporation believed that agricultural loyalty could be purchased, merged, and optimized on a financial spreadsheet. They assumed that a farmer's connection to a machine was purely transactional. They failed to understand that in the American dirt, a tractor is not merely a capital asset. It is a physical partner in a high-stakes, weather-dependent gamble. When the parent company treated the dealer network as a disposable corporate liability rather than a vital, living ecosystem, they severed the only lifeline that could have saved them during the debt crisis. They proved that you can buy an agricultural heritage, but you cannot spreadsheet a harvest. The corporations moved on, the ledgers were closed. The executives retired, leaving the consequences out in the weather. Somewhere off a gravel road in Black Hawk County, Iowa, a silver field boss 4150 sits idling beside a corrugated steel grain bin. The silver paint is oxidized and peeling back to reveal the heavy iron casting underneath. But the massive Caterpillar V8 engine is still firing, still turning the hydraulic pumps, still waiting for a hand on the throttle to drag a heavy implement through the dark American soil. See you in the next one.